each week. We are excited to welcome with us Anthony Richards. Anthony has worked at the Imperial War Museum for more than 20 years, where he is responsible for the document and sound archives. A qualified archivist, he has contributed to many publications and media projects based on personal written testimony of the two world wars, including articles for the Telegraph newspaper, the Royal Mail Stamp Yearbook, and the ITV series The Great War, The People's Story. He is also the author of several books, including The Somme, A Visual History, In Their Own Words, and Documents That Changed History. He's joining us tonight to discuss his brand new book, The True Story of the Christmas Truce, British and German Eyewitness Accounts from the First World War. Now, a quick note for our audience. We generally are live when we bring this to you, but we are recording this in advance. Anthony is in London, and that is a very big time difference. So this allows us to speak with him and not have him be up in the middle of the night. So we are so grateful to be able to do that. And we're grateful for you joining us. Thank you, Anthony.
No, thank you for having me. Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Well, Anthony, you work at a great museum, by the way, and what an interesting thing you've done here, taking these eyewitness accounts. Why don't we, I'm sure that nearly everyone watching has heard of this, but why don't you take us through the basic outline, the events, and then we'll dive deeper.
Yeah, sure. So the Christmas Truce, this occurred right at the beginning of the First World War. So Christmas 1914. And the thing, I suppose, about the Christmas Truce, and the reason that it's always been of huge interest to me, is that it's an anomaly. It's a strange, weird kind of event that happened in the middle of a war, where both sides, for various reasons, decided to put down their guns, climb out of the trenches, and basically fraternize with each other. Chat, play games, swap souvenirs, share food, all on and around Christmas 1914. And like I say, it's an anomaly. It's not the sort of thing you would ever expect to happen in the middle of a war. Nothing really happened like this before then, and nothing's happened since. And so it's always been a sort of a kind of a source of fascination to me why it happened and why it never happened again. Because if you look at it as just one event in the middle of a war, usually you can look at how that event has influenced the course of the war or made a real difference in some way. But with the Christmas Truce, in many ways, it's almost inconsequential that it didn't end the war and it didn't really affect the way that people thought about it, but we still remember it as being a key event. So I think that's really interesting, and that's why I wanted to write this book. And also to sort of tell the story through the words of the soldiers themselves who experienced it, which I think is always really important. That's something I've tried to do in all my books, actually, is to go back to the original sources, whether they're letters or diaries and oral history interviews and things like that, to look at that original testimony and to tell the story in that way. I think that's really important.
Indeed, and you've also brought multiple perspectives to it, both sides, as it were.
Absolutely. And for something like the Christmas Truce, it's often, the story has often been told mostly from the British perspective. And I felt it was quite important to actually look at the other side as well, to see how the Germans were involved in it. In fact, that you could argue they were the main instigators of the whole thing. But also the French and the Belgians and other nationalities as well, who were there at the same time, who were involved. So this is very much an attempt to, well, as the title of the book suggests, to tell the true story of the Christmas Truce for the first time, to actually look at it in a much sort of wider and global way than has perhaps been done before.
Sure. Was there one Christmas truce, or did this happen at a few places along the line?
So I always think that the best way to look at the Christmas Truce is that actually, although we remember it as being one big event, which happened at Christmas 1914, actually it's more accurate to say that it was lots of much smaller events which happened to occur at the same time, which collectively could be described as the Christmas Truce. And to sort of explain that, really, if you're looking at trench warfare at the beginning of the First World War, the trenches were split into sectors, and each sector was its own sort of entity. So you'd have several thousand men manning each sector, but the experience from one sector to another could be very, very different. So in one, you might get soldiers who wanted to have a kind of almost like a live and let live attitude with the enemy. So their attitude would be, well, we won't fire on you in the hope that you won't fire on us. And so, and particularly at the beginning of the First World War, there were lots of examples of this where certain parts of the line were known as being quite nice ones almost to serve in, because the danger was much less, because they had these agreements in place already, which were basically ceasefires. But then other parts of the line, you may get an area where one of the regiments was maybe a very old traditional guards regiment who would have been maybe a bit more sort of aggressive and would have thought, no, we're here to fight the war, so we're not going to do any ceasefires. We're just going to try and shoot as many as we can. And so in that area, the war would just carry on as normal. So all along the line, the experience of individual soldiers was very different considering where you were. So in some places, you would have a ceasefire agreement where people could be fraternizing with the enemy and swapping souvenirs and things like that. In other areas, the war would just carry on as normal. So with the Christmas Truce, it was concentrated around the area of Flanders, around the town of Ypres, which tended to be where the British were mainly holding the line. But it also happened in various other places all across France and Belgium, actually, but mainly Flanders.
Got it. There are just so many interesting things about it. But why don't we start with the question that I'm sure some folks have, which is trench warfare was extensive in the Great War, but we really haven't seen it since then. What brought that about?
Yes, I mean, it was something that was very, very particular to the First World War. And I think it's largely due to the way that war was initially fought, in that, at the very beginning, you get a number of key battles, but none of them are particularly decisive. And so you get two big armies. You get the Germans on the one side, you get the French and the Belgians and the British on the other, who are basically facing each other, trying to get an advantage. And so what begins is what people since have called the race to the sea, where each side was trying to outmaneuver and outflank the other as they advanced north to the Belgian coast. But neither really got any kind of advantage. And so you end up with both armies in a deadlock, and this line of trenches where they've literally dug in to maintain their positions, and with the line of trenches running from the Belgian coast, literally on the beach of Belgium, right through France, down to the border with Switzerland in the mountains, an almost ceaseless line of trenches. And that's really how it stayed for many, many years, for pretty much the rest of the war.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but those trenches were really kind of self-contained in that there would be living quarters and other things. So you were there in that trench for an extended period, right? You didn't step up there to fight and then go to the back.
No, I mean, that they would rotate the troops. So, you might have a week or so in the front line and then be brought back and then for a period of rest and so on. But yes, you would spend, if you were in the infantry in the trenches, you would be spending huge amounts of your time living in these awful conditions, really. I mean, literally holes dug in the ground, open to the elements. So, the rain, snow, frost, which of course, they would have had around the Christmas Truce as well. It was definitely frosty at that time. The trenches would often be flooded. There'd be rats everywhere, terrible living conditions generally, very poor hygiene.
Yeah. Well, talk to us then about how this happened. We can kind of, I think, imagine what might take place once everyone had kind of, both sides had agreed, okay, we're not going to fire, we're going to kind of fraternize, as it were. But how does that start? How does one or a few men on each side say, I'm going to take the chance and step out of the trench?
Essentially, yes. I think that's pretty much what happened. I suppose it's important to say that there were examples of this sort of thing right from the beginning of the war. And this relates to what we've been talking about, trench warfare, because you would get, in some places, the frontline trenches would be very near to the German frontline trenches. You'd have a space between them, which they call no man's land, which was a sort of the sort of contested ground between them. But in some cases, it was so near that you could throw things from one trench to another. You could certainly hear people in the other trench. You could shout at them, do all sorts of things like that. And so when you get two armies basically camped together incredibly closely, it's kind of inevitable that they start to talk to one another, or, and it might start off as just, the odd shouted insult or something. But over time, I think both armies realized that they were basically experiencing exactly the same thing, that they were both living in awful conditions. They were both experiencing this sort of constant feeling of danger, that they might be killed at any moment by a stray bullet or some shelling. They both had pretty poor food, the hygiene. They both shared the same weather, and when you're in a situation like that, it's kind of human nature, isn't it, to empathize with the other person. So in the run-up to Christmas in 1914, I think there was definitely this sort of keenness, I suppose, to maybe fraternize and to try and encourage ceasefires wherever possible. And the real catalyst, I suppose, was Christmas itself, which gave them the perfect opportunity. And really what started it off in many cases were the Germans starting to celebrate Christmas. So there's lots of accounts of the British soldiers being in their trenches, often on Christmas Eve. And when it got dark, they looked out and they could see lights beginning to appear in the German trenches. And what it was the Germans lighting Christmas trees. And then as the evening went on, they heard the sound of singing, and it was the start of Christmas carols and patriotic songs and things like that. And you can imagine the sort of feeling where, Christmas was a special time anyway, but to experience this kind of sort of slightly otherworldly sort of sound of singing in the middle of a war and the lights of a Christmas tree, I think it was almost too much for them. And they thought, no, what we're doing, we've got to kind of make the most of this opportunity, which was a very special one. And so the British would often join in. There's certainly accounts where they almost had a kind of a singing contest between them and would shout scores and things like this. And they tried to outdo one another. And they'd often have musical instruments in the trenches anyway, so they'd be playing that and playing an accompaniment to someone else singing. And then I suppose it probably came down to the odd particularly brave soldier sort of shouting out, well, if I come over and shake your hand, will you kill me? And they'll say, no, come on over. And so, this would happen here and there. And before you knew it, in some cases, first of all, a handful might go out and meet in no man's land. And then before you know it, hundreds are out there. And then they're playing football and running around and doing all sorts of things, having haircuts in the middle of no man's land and things like this. It's just amazing, really.
Well, indeed. And any idea why it would have started maybe on the German side as opposed to the British?
Well, when I say started in the German side, that's a bit of a generalization, because sure, there's other instances where the British started it, or even in some cases the French or the Belgians, but largely it was the Germans. And I think it's because Germany has a very strong tradition linked with Christmas.
Yep.
So, a lot of our existing Christmas traditions, like, the Christmas tree, I believe is German originally. Things like greeting cards at Christmas is a sort of a German idea. Things like this, the idea of lighting a tree, it's very, very German. And of course, a lot of the Christmas carols and the hymns, exactly, like Silent Night is the one that everyone talks about, which was sung there. That was sung in the original German. So, it would have been very automatic, I think, for the German soldiers to want to celebrate Christmas, sure, despite being in the middle of a war.
Well, let's go to some of the things that you found out in your research of these original documents, reading the letters and diaries and so forth of these men. What were some of the surprises that you came across?
I think it was, well, one of the surprises is how friendly the soldiers were to one another, which I've always thought was sort of slightly odd, because if you're sent to a war in a foreign land, and of course they were both in foreign lands, because Germany had invaded France and Belgium, and Britain had turned up to help, but it was neither was their actual sort of home. So they would turn up to fight this enemy who was sort of slightly faceless. And yet, when you look at the original letters and the diaries and the memoirs, and even the interviews with veterans many, many years later, they all pretty much say that they didn't have any real animosity towards their enemies at all. And there was this acceptance that it was almost like they were there to do a job, and they were very willing to do the job and fight for their country. But that's all it was. It was a job. It's not that they were taking any pleasure in this at all. It was very much like the attitude of the professional soldier, I suppose. And you don't get that quite so much in something like the Second World War, for instance, where it becomes a much more sort of personal conflict, and there's a lot more hatred and general dislike for the enemy. Probably for good reason. But in the First World War, particularly at the start in 1914, which is what we're talking about, that hadn't really developed at all. And that was probably one of the big factors, I suppose, why the truce happened, that people were very open to the idea.
Were there some other things you found out about specific encounters, specific ways this was kind of celebrated up and down these hundreds of miles of trenches?
Well, yes, I mean, Christmas, I suppose, is a time for sharing, isn't it? You know, whether it's sharing a meal or whatever. And they very much took advantage of that, in that they would share meals. They would share what meager rations they had. They would exchange presents. So there were lots of instances of Germans giving British soldiers cigars to take home and this sort of thing, having photographs taken, things like that. The funniest one, in a way, is they actually went hunting together, that they were wandering around in no man's land having a chat, the Germans and the British, and suddenly someone spotted a hare or a rabbit which happened to just sort of emerge, and a German took a shot at it, and then the British did as well, and before you knew it they were both chasing off after this poor creature. And then there was another instance where a British soldier was given a haircut by a German soldier. You know, strange, sort of bizarre things. And of course, the famous incident, which people always refer to, is the games of football which were played, which were not sort of proper football matches in terms of equal teams and goalposts and the referee or anything like that. It was just an opportunity to kick around a football, really, because you have to remember that because the soldiers had all been in trenches for months and months, to suddenly have the opportunity to be out in the open, where you could run around without any worry and breathe in the fresh air and so on. I mean, that would have been an amazing feeling, really. And football is well suited to that. You can just have a run around and use your energy up, and a sort of a friendly rivalry, I suppose.
Yeah. And we'll translate. I think most everyone knows that what we're talking about in America here would be called soccer.
Soccer, yes.
And
yes.
And football in Europe. Did you get a sense that there was a difference in perception from the troops on either side?
There was... I think no, both sides really largely felt the same way about the truce, in that I think they both felt that it was a sort of an acceptable thing to do, to let off steam for a day or two over Christmas and then go back to normal. And that's very much reinforced by the attitude of the higher commands of both sides as well, in that they both acted pretty much exactly the same once they found out about it.
And that reaction was?
Which was to shut it down straight away. I mean, in the event, they were pretty much too late, because there was always a delay. I mean, you know, obviously in those days, getting information from the front line back to the headquarters was not that straightforward, and often it would rely on physical pieces of paper being carried back with a courier. But once they found out, it was kind of too late, and it was often they were often back to fighting anyway, so there's not much they could do about it. So instead, the higher commands of both sides stressed the fact that it shouldn't happen in the future, and that's what they concentrated on.
And indeed it did not, correct?
Yes. I mean, that there were definitely instances of more ceasefires and more fraternization here and there, but it was very localized. And there's a few reasons for that. One is what we've just said, that it was the higher command basically making sure it didn't happen again. So they would issue very strict orders. The first lot of such orders were issued just before Easter in 1915, because they thought Easter might see another
When
sort of
breaking out for
celebration.
a few days here, right? We can't have that happening.
No, exactly. And then the same with Christmas. Christmas 1915. They thought there's no way we're going to have this again. So they were very, very strict about it.
And how was it reported back home? I assume soldiers were writing letters, and of course there was extensive press coverage of the war generally. How did this play in the papers?
Well, it's very interesting because yes, the first news back home was through the letters of soldiers who had written home, and so it was really that period between Christmas and New Year when the letters started to turn up, and some newspapers got hold of these letters and started publishing them. And initially, there was a lot of disbelief that people just couldn't believe it had happened, because it sounds crazy that in the middle of a huge war, both sides suddenly decided to put down their arms and be friends for a few hours or a couple of days or whatever. So people genuinely didn't believe it and thought, no, this is just crazy. Someone's made this up. And it was only when photographs started to be published that they thought, oh no, hang on, this is actually something that's very real that's happened.
Was it met with, in addition to surprise, was it met with any disapproval, something like, hey, you shouldn't be doing that? Or was there this sense of, this is the kind of thing that is kind of wonderful that it did happen at Christmas?
It was largely the latter, that I think people saw it as a great story, really. And it's interesting because if you look at, say, the British press, for the first few months of the war, it's full of anti-German propaganda. The dastardly Hun who were bayoneting babies and murdering nuns and all this sort of thing. But then suddenly, for this really brief period over the Christmas Truce, it's suddenly, the Germans were, gracious enough to extend an olive branch to us, and how wonderful, what a great sort of celebration of Christmas. But then before you know it, it's back to the war. And then the event of the Christmas Truce has been overtaken by the actual fighting and other things going on.
And I think you've alluded to it or referred to it as sometimes happening over a few hours, in some cases over a couple of days. Do you want to talk a little more about why that might have been the case in one place or another? And then kind of a follow-up, was after this was over, were there troops saying, wait a minute, these guys got to do it and these guys just got to do it, but we didn't?
Yeah, absolutely. And the difficulty is what I was talking about earlier, in that the different sectors of the line would have had different experiences. So in some sectors, I mean, the kind of average experience, I suppose, of the Christmas Truce is that there might have been some singing and chatting on Christmas Eve. Christmas Day, you might have wandered out into no man's land and exchanged a few gifts. Then probably Boxing Day kind of petered out and that was it. But it differed wherever you were. So some sectors of the line had ceasefires which carried on well into the new year for weeks. Other sectors didn't experience anything. It was just a normal day. They'd be trying to kill each other. And this kind of real difference of experience led a lot of people to actually question whether the truce ever happened at all. And that's why it was seen for quite a long time, actually, as almost like a myth, one of those myths of the war that soldiers had made up, because it's a good story. And so even as late as the 1970s, I mean, there's an extract in my book from an interview with a First World War soldier from the 1970s, and they said to him, can you tell us about the Christmas Truce? And he said, well, I was there at Christmas 1914, but there was no truce, and I don't believe it ever happened. I think it's absolute rubbish. I mean, when you stop and think about it, why on earth would soldiers want to be friendly with the enemy? It just doesn't make sense. Of course it didn't happen. And this was in the 1970s, so there was this huge sort of disbelief over it. And it was all because different people had different experiences wherever they were. It was a real cross-section of different things.
And what brought it to a close, whether or not it was hours, a day, or multiple days?
In some cases where it had gone on for a while, it might have been because the authorities closed it down. So they will have sent orders to those in the front line saying, look, stop it or you'll be in trouble. But in the majority of cases, it was quite a natural sort of end. And it usually came around, it might have been something as simple as daylight fading and everyone just thinking, oh, we're just going to go back to the trenches now. And then when they got up the next morning,
sure,
the opportunity had gone. So it just sort of carried on as normal. But, in other instances, the whole point of the ceasefire in a way was that you would set aside an agreed amount of time. So they might say, we'll start firing at 10 o'clock this evening. And that would be the end. So, 10 minutes to 10, everyone would go back to the trenches and then the war would carry on. That was quite a popular way to do it.
Was there any lasting impact of this other than the ongoing discussion of did it happen or didn't, and then it appearing in popular media and so forth over the years and books?
No, I mean, it's funny because, like I said before, in many ways, the Christmas Truce is inconsequential. It really is an anomaly. It's an odd little story. An event that definitely happened, but which doesn't really fit in with the narrative of the First World War. So if you pick a random published history of the First World War, it might mention the Christmas Truce, but if it does, it's probably as a footnote. This happened over Christmas, but don't worry about that because it's not really very important. But in a way, that's why it's interesting that it did happen. And what's also interesting is that we remember it so well today, particularly in Britain. It's remembered with a lot of affection, probably because of the link to football or soccer, our sort of national game. And so certainly in this country, when people think of the First World War, the Christmas Truce has kind of become part of the shorthand of illustrating and explaining the First World War. So when people think of the First World War, they probably think of mud, trenches, war poetry, poppies, and soldiers playing football at Christmas.
Well, let me pick up on that with two things that may help folks who are watching get a better idea of what the First World War was. And obviously, in addition to the book, and we've got links to your book in the comments. Your museum partnered, I believe, with Peter Jackson and put out a brilliant documentary on the First World War. Just curious, did you have anything to do with that? And second, as somebody who's an archivist and who has spent their life understanding what really did happen, what's your assessment of that in terms of an accurate representation of what took place, at least among certain men?
My link with the film was a slightly remote one, although I was involved in it because they used a lot of personal testimony from the soldiers themselves, which were interviews that we'd recorded largely in the 1970s. And which actually, if people are interested, you can listen to in their entirety on the Imperial War Museum website. If you go, it's quite interesting. You can hear these interviews, which are often, quite a few hours in length, but you can hear the soldiers themselves talking about what their experiences, which are great, because there's nothing better than hearing the stories from the people themselves in their actual voices with the accents and all the jokes and things like this. Sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Did you think that the resulting documentary was
yes,
representation, and is it something you'd recommend for people to see?
Yeah, I would recommend it. I thought it was very cleverly done. In that, what he did is he took the original film from the time, which is preserved by the IWM, but digitally changed it and sort of added color and did this sort of strange thing, which I don't really understand, where it's almost sort of animated their faces in a sort of clever way. So it does help to bring it alive.
Let me add, if I can, there was a making of documentary that was part of when I saw it in the theater here, and one of the things they explained was the difference in the frame rate, and so
yes.
you take the earlier frame rates that if you see them today, they they're essentially not fast enough, right, and the action doesn't appear fluid, and here, and again, I thought it was just brilliant. Imperial War Museum. I don't know who reached out to whom, but pulled in Peter Jackson, obviously a person of tremendous wealth and, more importantly, tremendous technical acumen in terms of making films. And they essentially digitally filled in those spaces so that the action appears fluid. And let me add one thing, because the whole matter of colorization and so forth is certainly something that is controversial in some circles. My sense in seeing the film was that very quickly you stopped any kind of awareness of any effect, and you just watched what happened, and just really brilliantly done. And I hope that making of documentary is out there somewhere, also maybe YouTube or whatever, because it's really fascinating, all that went into it. And then let me offer something else here from this side of the pond. In outside Boston, in the Hudson or Stowe is a museum, and I believe the name is the American Heritage Museum, and they have a fabulous collection of armaments, vehicles, and so forth from all many conflicts that the United States was involved in, including, of course, World War I. And at the very beginning of that, they have reconstructed a section of a trench, and so you can walk down into it, and you get an idea of, again, in a very controlled setting, but you get an idea of what it might have been like to be in that trench. And then there's some audio visual things that happen and so on. It is a brilliant museum, and this is one of the things that's interesting to see if one's able to go. Well, Anthony, this has been great. Carrie has some questions. I think she's gonna join us here and ask those.
All right. So we have a question from a viewer, and she would like to know, did the Christian churches of the time make any effort to promote peace and support the soldiers continuing this short-lived truce?
Yes, the simple answer is yes, they did. The Pope and the Catholic Church, and in fact several of the other churches as well, were very vocal in the run-up to Christmas in their sort of calls for some kind of ceasefire. And they were calls for that. It wasn't so much calls to end the war, because I think they were realistic enough to think, that's not so straightforward. But they were definitely calling for some kind of ceasefire over Christmas, partly to respect Christmas itself, but also to give both sides an opportunity to sort of reflect on the entire war and to try and come to some kind of diplomatic resolution. So there were definitely attempts. They didn't really influence the Christmas Truce in the trenches. And that's because there was a huge separation between what was happening out in France and Belgium and what was happening back home. So for those back home, they genuinely didn't know what was happening out there until after the event, pretty much. But there were, in that sort of run up to Christmas 1914, which was the first Christmas of the war, remember, there were a lot of people desperately wanting it to end. And certainly in this country, it became almost a bit of a joke, really, that people said, oh, it'll all be over by Christmas. Which is what they also said in the Second World War. And it was equally as inaccurate then. But the wish was there, the desire was there for peace, but it just wasn't to be.
So kind of building on that, why is it that they thought this might be a short war? Was there a history of short wars that they thought, this will be another one along those lines?
But basically, yes. Basically, the nearest sort of comparable war, I suppose, had been in South Africa, the Boer War, which was fairly short and quite sort of self-contained. And with the First World War, there was completely an expectation there'd be some kind of fighting going on, probably in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, which had been a bit of a hotbed for all sorts of problems for years. So everyone was expecting something would happen, but not to the extent that it eventually did by pulling in everyone else. So yeah, I think it was a bit of a surprise. And even when it became a whole sort of European-wide war, even then people thought, well, it might carry on a bit into next year. But if someone said, oh, this will carry on for the next 4 years, people would have been in shock, really. And also, it would drag in the United States, so far distant, the other side of the world. And yet, it became a proper global war. So it was a whole new experience. And that early on in 1914, people just weren't quite ready for that yet, I don't think.
Definitely. Okay, a question about the truce. When they were out in no man's land talking to the other side, did they kind of use that as an opportunity to do any sort of intelligence work or, kind of scope out the other trenches?
Yes, they definitely did. They definitely did. One of the kind of myths, I suppose, of the Christmas Truce is that it was just the sort of the working class private soldiers who were trucing and the officers were against it. Actually, the officers in the front line were all for it as well, because they saw it as an opportunity to get intelligence about what was happening with the Germans. And there were in my book, there's loads of examples of intelligence reports that soldiers submitted after the truce, where they list huge amounts of information that they uncovered from just talking to the Germans. So they would say, they were dressed very shabbily, which sort of suggests they weren't being supplied very well. They were complaining about the food that they got. Someone mentioned they hadn't received any mail from home for a week, sort of funny little details like that. And also a lot more specific details. So they might say, oh, yes, we managed to look inside their trench and we saw that it wasn't very well protected. And if we raid them next week, we could probably take it over and sort of things like that. So although we see the Christmas Truce as this kind of example of sort of friendship and peace, actually from both sides of it. They were using it as an opportunity to kind of get one over on the other side.
Okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense. All right, we'll wrap up with one question here. Was there any, specific interaction that happened that really stood out to you that was unique or interesting?
I think that there's a particular piece of testimony from a soldier, and again, this is in the book, a British soldier, and he describes playing football with the Germans. And what's interesting about his testimony is that he actually admitted to being terrified the whole time throughout the truce. And again, this is something that people often don't pick up on, because there's this presumption that if you are out in no man's land fraternizing, you were quite happy to be there. But he was terrified. He was very young. I think he was only about sort of 18 or 19. So very young, very inexperienced. And he didn't trust the Germans at all. And they were giving him sweets, and they were giving him cigarettes. And he said he accepted them, but he wasn't going to have them because he thought they might be poisoned. And when he was playing football, he was constantly thinking, they're going to shoot us at any minute. I don't like this at all. And the first chance he got, he was back in his own trench. And I thought that's really interesting, because it's not often you get someone as honest as that, and there would have been the equivalent from the German side as well. I'm sure, lots of the German troops thought, well, we don't trust those British. They're going to shoot us as soon as they get the chance. So there was a lot of uncertainty over the whole thing. So the Christmas Truce is one of those events where we all see it as a celebration of peace, but the more you look at it, the more layers you sort of peel away, the more interesting it gets, the different sort of attitudes and the fears and the hopes of the people involved. Yeah.
Definitely. That's very interesting. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been fantastic. And you definitely want to check out the book, because, as always, there's so much more in there. And it is hot off the presses, just coming out. So we have a link to that in the chat. You can check that out. And also we'll have it on the page where this is archived. So make sure you take a look at that. And if you enjoyed this tonight, there are a few things you can do to help support it. You can tell your friends about it, share our emails, our social posts with them. And if you're not on our email list, you can sign up at historycamp.org and get those emails every week so that you stay up to date on what is happening. And consider making a small donation to the Pursuit of History. That's the nonprofit that brings these to you every week. Now, next week, we will be speaking with Claire Bellerjeau, Tiffany Yecke Brooks about the Revolutionary War story of a spy and an enslaved woman who helped turn that spy into an unapologetic abolitionist. So that will be an interesting story. Join us next week. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. And thank you, Anthony.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.